Please sign up to be notified when Man-Child issue 3 launches on Kickstarter October 1st. The Monarch Crier is outnumbered as the Sadistic Six debut in the third pulse-pounding issue of this Silver Age-inspired superhero action dramedy. We're going to need all the support we can get with this book so we can get it funded, so please sign up using the link in the description below. If you're a fan of the Lee, Kirby, Ditko era of comics, if you really love good old-fashioned superhero storytelling with a modern-day twist, this book is for you. Like I said, we're going to be introducing all new 6 villains for this book, so I cannot wait to share this new issue with you guys. Now to the video. 2 customers walk into a comic shop. The first customer, let's call them the Wednesday Warrior, greets their LCS employee on duty and picks up their stack of weekly books reserved from their pull list. Before the Wednesday Warrior checks out, they decide to scour the back issues and dollar bin to see if they can fill in some holes in their collection at home. The second customer, let's call them the Weeb, is having no luck finding what they came there for. Shockingly, there's only a few high-number volumes of some popular manga title they've already read hidden behind other trade paperbacks. The Weeb comes up to the counter, scratches their head, and asks a question they already know the answer to. Do you have any manga? The employee then points to those same volumes over on that hard-to-reach shelf that most likely hasn't been dusted in a while. The Weeb thanks the clerk and walks out of the store defeated while the Wednesday Warrior shouts Eureka as they find the final issue of a run they've been trying to complete for the better part of a year. The comic book market is evolving, and depending on who you ask, manga has become its greatest rival or biggest and brightest savior. Paired with Dave Pilkey's Dogman sales and junior graphic novels by Raina Telgemeier and others, comics as a medium is thriving. Comics have flooded bookstores, big box stores, and resale shops, becoming more widespread and available to the masses like never before. And if you're including digital options like Marvel Unlimited, Webtoon, Tapaz, Global Comics, or the Shonen Jump app, there's never been a better time to read and discover comics. Its acceptance as a legitimate entertainment art form is without question. Because of this evolving market, whether for good or ill, the definition of comics has evolved with these changing times. For decades, when people spoke of comics, they only thought of 2 things: comic newspaper strips, i.e. the funny pages, and superheroes. Now that the landscape has adjusted, or better yet, corrected itself, the definition of comics has become replaced, expanding into a broader, all-encapsulating umbrella term. Comics is manga, comics is manhwa, comics is Marvel and DC. And yet, despite knowing this and affirming it as truth, the Wednesday Warrior within me wants to take the Weeb aside and say, "Bro, did you read the sign? This is a comic book store. What did you expect?" Not all comic book stores are created equal. Not all are going to carry what everyone wants. Just as there are specialized pockets of fandom within nerd culture, there are specialized kinds of comic book shops. Some are more back issue or collector oriented. Some are more new release or merch oriented. They come in all shapes and sizes today, but that wasn't always the case because the direct market success has hinged upon healthy Marvel Comics and DC Comics sales ever since there was a direct market to begin with. For decades, Marvel and DC represented all of comics in the Western public sphere. Manga, underground, and alternative comics were eclipsed by the big 2, and even other publishers like Valiant or Image followed in their footsteps with the monthly 24 to 32 page single-issue formula. This business model persists to this day, but time will tell for how long. As a comic book reader who grew up going to comic book stores on the regular, and who still does after nearly 2 decades, the conversation around whether manga should be considered comics has always been more nuanced, in my opinion, not as cut and dry. Obviously, manga meets the technical criteria of, and I quote, juxtaposed pictorial and other images in deliberate sequence intended to convey information and or to produce an aesthetic response in the viewer, unquote, as defined by Scott McCloud in his book Understanding Comics, and falls under this definition of comics as a medium. However, I would like to pose the notion that manga isn't comics, and it hasn't been comics, in America specifically, for decades. I can hear the sharpening of pitchforks as we speak, but before the lynching begins, let me stand on my anecdotal soapbox for a minute or two, then I'll willingly surrender myself over. The literal definition for manga is Japanese comic books. Manga is comics, a specific type of comic, but it isn't comics. If it was, would we not just generally call manga comics? Wouldn't that be confusing? Wouldn't they just be shelved alphabetically right alongside the graphic novels, going from Daredevil to Demon Slayer, for example? So why the distinction? When asked what they're reading, no one answers comics if they're holding a manga or Japanese comic in their hand. We call it manga and not comics during conversations because, I'll say it again, while manga is comics, it's only comics in the fastest and loosest sense of the word. If we were to be precise, it's not comics of the American or European variety, or in other words, not the comics I or thousands of others saw stocked in any comic book stores growing up. And to be fair, this was to the detriment of many American and European readers. This detail isn't to be used as a point of pride, but one of embarrassment. How many more stories, characters, and worlds were comic book fans ignorant of because their LCS didn't carry manga, because it wasn't available? Readers today don't know how difficult it used to be to find manga out in the wild. Now it lines the shelves at Barnes & Nobles and Targets across the US. Not comics, but manga. See what I did there? Our brains have been trained to distinguish the two terms even though they are the same medium because your average comic book reader is not your average manga reader and vice versa. Of course, there are exceptions, but Western comics and manga lure two distinct kinds of fan bases that at times do intersect, but not always. And to lump them into one bucket muddies the comic book readership waters because on a rather fundamental cultural as well as generational level, they are not the same. There is an undeniable difference between the American comic book market and manga, but I want to be absolutely clear that this difference doesn't make manga any less than comics. The newspaper strips should be seen as any less than comics. They're both just not comics, as myself and many others see them who have been visiting their local comic shop for a number of years. If you hadn't guessed already, there's an intense nostalgic fondness I have for the American comic book industry, especially when it pertains to superhero comics. Superhero characters are why I began reading comics when I was a child, and believe it or not, while I'm still reading them as an adult. These characters transcend their CMYK 2D boundaries. They're symbols, they're inspirations, they're why I go to the movie theater, they're why I bonded with my older brother, they're why I make my own creator-owned comics, and they're why comics still exist today. I have nothing against reading right to left or black and white art or a smaller compact book. My investment just isn't there. Instead, I have the utmost respect for digging through long boxes, bagging and boarding floppies, and bombarding my eyes with colored artwork styles of endless variety, all things to this day that manga cannot give me. For an art form that originated in America to be crushed under the weight of other more successful permutations is frankly alarming and a little upsetting. It's a frustrating experience for a comic book reader like me, someone who's only read a handful of manga titles but thousands of American comics, to see the sales numbers and enthusiasm of the mainstream comic book market pale in comparison to its Japanese or South Korean superiors. There's an ecosystem and community of American comics, including Marvel and DC, that is waning in comparison, and while comics as a medium are objectively not dying, comics as I've known them all my life are. Whether it's the embrace of AI or NFTs, declining single issue sales, comic book stores closing, manga's growing fan base, or just the digital age we live in, the future of comics, the future of the floppy, doesn't actually appear like the future of comics to me, but the future of something comics adjacent. The definition is bending and breaking and transforming into a medium I no longer recognize. I wouldn't even necessarily consider this a bad thing per se, and actually it could be a good thing in sustaining the longevity of these characters in the direct market, and having these stores adjust to it could be very beneficial for them. But I think it's very important to acknowledge this transition that is happening and not get offended when there's some pushback. Mind you, this is coming from a Gen Z comic book reader, not a sweaty old man. I swear, what I would give to be born in an era of comics where all you worried about was running out of pen and ink and meeting a deadline, while it's rubbing shoulders with the greats of the Marvel and DC bullpens of yesteryear. Comics have struggled mightily to remain relevant and financially sustainable more often than not over the years, but at least everyone was on the same page and knew what they were fighting to preserve. I've read some utterly fantastic manga, and I've watched some truly excellent anime. And no, not just the generic usual suspects like Yu-Gi-Oh! And Dragon Ball Z. But nothing gets me more on fire about comic books than when I go through my comic book collection or walk into a comic book store and take in the decades of craftsmanship that was poured into the American comic book industry. Each issue is a time capsule to another time, another place, and another world. Hell, Maybe I just need to read more manga, and in doing so, I wouldn't feel this strongly about Men in Tights. I concede that my definition of comics needs to adapt and change with the times, but there's this involuntary resistance to let go of the methods and processes that open the doorway to the glorious landscape that is comic books for me. Comics is not one market, one art style, one genre, one company, one platform, one country, or one way of doing things. Perhaps the American comic book needs a term better describing itself like manga, but they've always ever been and always will be comics to this Wednesday warrior. So please don't misquote or misunderstand me. Like I said, of course, manga is comics. There's no room for debating that. But this is not this. It's just not, comics.